Joan by Carol M Mottershead. Chapter 3. "Well, I am glad to see you cheered up, Joan." The voice of the nurse made me jump. Startled for a moment, my eyes opened wide. I smiled lazily as I gathered my wits around me. It was tea time. "I wasn't sure if you had your full appetite back yet, so I've given you something light. If that's not to your taste, or if you'd like something else, just ring your buzzer." She was gone as quickly as she arrived. I needed a moment or two to rouse myself before I could even look at the plate of food in front of me. I felt calm. My memories left me feeling quite normal for a while, pleasantly happy. A sense of peace. And then reality checked in. I was in hospital. Why? Why couldn't anyone tell me? I started to nibble at the cold roast chicken and salad on my plate. It was tasteless, but acceptable once I'd added the limited condiments for flavouring. I hadn't realised just how hungry I was until I started eating. For hospital food, it really wasn't too bad. Ice cream again for dessert. I felt quite refreshed when the nurse came back for the dishes. "Well, I can see your appetite is healthy enough. Would you like some more? There's an ice cream left over. Can I tempt you?" She smiled. I nodded and grabbed my pen and paper while she was gathering the tray. Writing as quickly as I could, I wrote, "Could I have a cup of tea, please? Milk, no sugar. Thank you." "Of course you can, Joan. I'll be back in a tick." She came back, leaving the cup and saucer and a small packet of ginger biscuits. My favourites. I was left alone for a while and turned my attention to the magazines that Alison had brought in earlier. I did the crosswords. I even had time to read one or two articles, and I know she meant well, but really, articles on fashion? Me? Did she not know me at all? I shook my head, smiling at the thought of my friend. I suppose I can't blame her really, for she knows very little about me. I met Alison only a few years ago, when I was homeless. She works in a women's refuge. She took me in when I had nowhere else to go, gave me a roof over my head and food for my tummy, no questions asked. She even helped me to get back on my feet, building my confidence, and even helped me to find a place to call my own. Somehow we'd remained friends. I've had very few friends in my lifetime, but Alison was like a mother hen looking after her chick. She was intent on taking me under her wing. She's asked few questions of me, and I've told her so little. All she knows is that I have been hospitalised after being struck by my husband and wasn't expected to survive. But I did. When I came round, I had discovered that he had run away, taking my son with him, and I've been searching for them ever since. A nurse pushed open the door. My eyes closed at the noise from the clunking medicine trolley as it resounded in my ears. The night shift must have come on duty, as it was the nurse from the previous night who entered. "Are you still with us?" she smiled. "How are you feeling today, then? Still got no voice?" I nodded and smiled back in response. "And how did you get on with that writing? I left you pen and paper on the side. Did you find it easy enough?" Once again I smiled and nodded and reached for pen and paper, scribbling a few words. "Thank you for the pen and paper. I have told them all I can remember, which isn't much. I can't remember why I'm here. I don't understand why I can't speak. What will happen to me? When can I go home?" You'll be seeing the doctor on her rounds tomorrow, Joan. Be a patient until then. There's a good lass. Dr. Venables is a very good doctor. She'll tell you what they can do to help, okay? Now, let's settle you down. Here, take your tablets, there's a good girl. Do you need anything before I leave? Can you manage to go to the bathroom yourself? I nodded. I tried standing and managed a couple of steps and signalled with a thumbs up that I was fine, and she left the room. That night I lay awake for some time before the tablets finally kicked in. But no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't remember what brought me to be in hospital. I tried to look positive in front of the nurses, but inside, what would I do if I couldn't speak again? How would I earn a living? My voice. I need my voice. Oh, Nicholas, where are you? I fell asleep, calling his name in my mind and sobbing. The drugs that the nurse had given me lulled me into such a relaxed sleep that my mind seemed to free fall into my distant past once again, remembering those first few occasions of meeting my husband. It was like my mind was indeed kick-starting itself, as the nurse had suggested it might. I was remembering or dreaming about those earlier days, when Pulcinella and I first would find ourselves pumping into each other whenever he was in Rome. I remember the times I'd seen him at the water fountain, where governess and I would stop to drink the cool, fresh water on a hot day. He would give me that roguishly cheeky grin of his that thrilled my beating heart every time I saw him. Then there was the local hostelry, an inn where governess liked to partake of a light snack before setting off on our journey home. I enjoyed seeing him. Unfortunately, governess didn't. The inn became the local watering hole for all the performers. They would gather after the show, partake of food and drink, then entertain one another after a hard day performing. I remember this one time. Pulcinella picked up his guitar and announced that he was singing his next song to a special lady in the room. And he looked directly at me with his usual smile and a wink, and he began his song. I felt everyone's eyes were upon me, and I was so embarrassed I couldn't help but blush. But my heart reached out to him. Its beat quickened with excitement. At the time I was afraid everyone would hear. Afterwards, Pulcinella approached governess and I with a goblet of refreshing wine. His hand touched mine for a moment, and I blushed a second time. Governess missed nothing. She gave me another disapproving look, a look I eventually saw quite often. I didn't care. Governess was very aware of our status in society. She had been commissioned with teaching me propriety in all things, a task she took seriously. "Stop encouraging him," she would say. But I couldn't. I was young and foolish and very much in love. I chose to ignore her pleas, and would fall asleep repeating his name over and over to myself, hugging my pillow and picturing his smiling face as I lay in bed. Months passed. Pulcinella and I seemed constantly to bump into each other, but I didn't heed her warnings. Governess finally told father about our meetings, and he went crazy. We had the most horrendous arguments. Never before had I seen father so angry. He bellowed at me that I had a position to maintain in his household, duties to perform. He yelled that Pulcinella was a no-good gigolo, a vagrant, and I was acting no better than one of his wenches in their plays. He was livid. Unfortunately, in hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, my emotions got the better of me, and I replied in a way that shames my memory today. I screamed at him that I loved Pulcinella, and he'd asked me to go away with him, and that he had no right to tell me what to do. Not now. I'm not his wife. I told him that he'd never really loved me, never shown me nor Mother any love, leaving us alone as much as he did. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I knew I'd gone too far and started crying, more with anger than emotional distress. But if I could have bitten my tongue. He ordered me out of the room. I'd never argued with Father before. I'd never seen him that mad. But how dare he start interfering with my life? He'd barely been bothered whether I was dead or alive until he needed me for his own purposes. He had no right. It was my only way of justifying my anger. I remember crying myself to sleep, partly out of frustration and partly out of anger, but a lot because I was ashamed of my outburst. Justifying it to myself failed to ease my pain. I just wanted to hurt Father. The truth was that Pulcinella hadn't told me he loved me. He hadn't actually asked me to join him. In fact, since we first met, other than a little flirting, a little teasing, the odd surreptitious touching of hands, he had been a perfect gentleman. All the hopes and dreams were in my imaginings, but my feelings for him were real. I loved him. I hoped with all my heart that he felt the same. He'd often tease me about how much fun it would be to travel the world together, that I could be part of the show. Alone with my musings, I would imagine myself being part of their plays. I had it all worked out, though. I already knew how to play several musical instruments, and I had a good voice for narrating stories. Mother was so proud of me that she would often ask me to read or play a tune for their guests before retiring for the night. I was also taught how to cook and make clothes by the kitchen staff and seamstress. Mother insisted I learn all I would need to know. They are skills a girl will need one day, if she is to be a good wife, and you can guarantee the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, she would say. There were also skills that would be helpful as a member of the troupe as well, I used to think, as part of my musings. I knew that night had not seen the end of my outburst. I was summoned to the library early the next morning. I'd been sent to my room without supper. Governess must have been told to leave me alone, to my own devices for the night, which she did, for I didn't see her until the next morning. There was tension in the air as she made me bathe and dress before facing Father. I followed slowly behind her as she paraded me to the library for another confrontation with him. I was in no hurry to see him. Having cried myself to sleep, I was thoroughly exhausted upon awakening. Facing Father wasn't easy. He was still very angry. But despite feeling mortally ashamed of myself, averting my eyes to the floor, I still stood before him, resolute and stubborn, infuriating him further. He commanded me to sit down, which I did with reluctance. Father was a big man. He approached slowly and deliberately, looming over me like a great giant bear hungry for blood, and I was in his sights. I was afraid, but too stubborn and proud to admit it. I sat and waited for Father to speak. He told me he'd sent word for Pulcinella to attend our home that very morning. No reason had been given for the summons, and of course Pulcinella had no idea of what I had spoken. Poor Pulcinella. Poor me, for how was I going to face him? Father commanded me to send Pulcinella away and never see him again. I remember starting to weep angrily and shake my head in silence, but Father preempted my rebelliousness. He went on to say that if we both refused, then there would be only one thing left. We would have to marry. I was mortified, for it had all been in my head, all in my imaginings. Father was so angry at Pulcinella, I was afraid what he might do to him. I started to protest. I wanted him to cancel the summons, but I was silenced with one look. A look that filled me with fear. Fear of what he might do next. I remember Pulcinella knocking at the door. I rushed to answer his knock, hoping to tell him what had happened, but Father turned up just ahead of me and ordered me to go upstairs just as the door was being opened. Father's look dared me to challenge him at my peril. I walked slowly, reluctantly towards the stairs, and heard Father order Pulcinella to enter, with venom in his voice. He spat out his words of anger and annoyance, and I was afraid of what Father would say or do next. Father barely moved from the entrance, forcing Pulcinella to squeeze through a narrow gap, holding his breath as he passed. I looked back and saw Pulcinella looking over his shoulder in my direction. A questioning and fearful look in his eyes. He had no knowledge of what I had told Father the night before. Poor Pulcinella. What had I done? I felt so ashamed. Father stepped between us towards the library and marched Pulcinella to face his fate. As the doors closed, I rushed to the door, strained to hear what was being said. I could vaguely hear Father barking out his order for Pulcinella to sit, and visualised Father looming over him in much the same way as he had done with me the night before. Then the door was closed. Governess arrived. I had my ear close to the door, and she gave me a disapproving look and shook her head, tutting to herself. She knocked and entered the room to ask if anyone required refreshments, but was dismissed abruptly and told to leave them alone. With a surprised and angry look on her face, she pulled the door close behind her, throwing an even sterner look of disapproval in my direction. But the door remained ajar. I placed my ear to the gap just as Father began to speak. He told Pulcinella of what I had said the night before and demanded to know his intent towards me. I felt both embarrassed and afraid. What would Pulcinella think of me? What would be his reply? I wanted to run to my room with shame, but I had to hear his answer. To my surprise, Pulcinella declared to Father that he loved me. He said I was beautiful. He declared his love for me in such a poetic way that I pushed the door wide and rushed towards him just as Governess returned. As I neared Pulcinella, I saw the look on Father's face and stopped short, standing close enough to Pulcinella for the backs of our hands and fingers to touch momentarily, as we looked at one another before turning to face Father. I remember that moment well. Father asked me how I felt about this boy. I was embarrassed, excited, and a little afraid to reveal my feelings so publicly. But I stood firmly, yet shyly, and announced my love for Pulcinella. I looked to Pulcinella for his reaction, a nervous smile on my embarrassed face as I turned my head in excitement. Father wasn't pleased, and conspiratorial looks passed between he and Governess that I couldn't quite understand. There was a long silence. Eventually he announced that Pulcinella would have to prove his worthiness for my hand in marriage, and he would announce what that challenge would be in the morning, dismissing Pulcinella with instructions to return the next day. I had been so excited to hear Pulcinella say those beautiful, unexpected words that I hadn't truly considered how Father would react. Would Father make the challenge a one of life and death? Would Pulcinella reconsider his promises if the challenge was too difficult? Would he still think I was worth the challenge? I don't know. And all of a sudden I was so afraid I would lose him. Father dismissed Pulcinella as abruptly as he'd greeted him, instructing him to return early the next morning. All I could do was smile and look apologetically at him as he left. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was, but I was ordered to my room without food or water, which didn't bother me at first. I was too full with emotion to want to eat anyway. Eventually one of the servants arrived with refreshments, which I sent away in protest. The food was taken away, but the jug of water was left on the dresser. The hours seemed to drag, and as darkness fell, so the hunger pangs began. Everyone would have finished for the day, I thought, and decided to head for the kitchens to see if there was anything left over from supper. On my way across the landing, I overheard Father in his private chambers talking in hushed tones to governess. There was another voice, a deeper voice, that sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't recall where I'd heard it before. I leaned into the door, struggling to hear the voices, but as I did so I fell with an ungainly clatter into the room just as governess opened the door. My eyes quickly scanned the room to see who owned the other voice, but I was promptly ushered out of the doorway and back to my room by governess, who promised to bring me something to eat if I went back to my room without fuss. The next morning, breakfast was brought to my room with the message to get dressed for a journey and meet Father in the library within the hour. Nervously I picked at my food, barely able to swallow, then did as I was told. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, Father was just arriving. A curt nod of the head was the only greeting as he opened the door authoritatively and signalled with a movement of the head that I was to enter. To my surprise, I saw Pulcinella already in the room. Upon hearing the door open, he stood up quickly out of politeness, eyes averted, not looking in our direction, hoping to avoid eye contact with Father. My footsteps quickened as I saw him, my heart raced and I smiled nervously. The smile soon left my face after noticing a disapproving glance from Father. He told us all to sit, then stood quietly for a moment, as if contemplating on how to proceed. When he spoke, it was in an unexpectedly excited tone. He was savouring the delights of the challenge a bit too much, I thought. He told us about the new arrival one of the nearby neighbours was expecting that very morning. A strange-looking creature from Africa that was to join his menagerie of wild and exotic animals. The creature was called a cocodrillo. Father had only seen a drawing of the creature the previous night, but he seemed to relish in its description, watching for the face of Pulcinella fill with fear as he did so. But Pulcinella just stared bravely, I thought, until I noticed him gulp and smile nervously as he nodded and accepted the challenge. We were to leave within the hour. Father announced as he left the room, leaving governess behind as chaperone. I looked at Pulcinella, then at governess, She moved to the back of the room to give us some privacy. I tried profusely to apologise to him for putting him in such a predicament, but he gently and silently placed a finger to my lips to hush me. It was then that the tears began welling up in my eyes. He touched my cheek and told me not to cry, and said my eyes should not be clouded by tears. It was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to me. My bosom swelled with the love I felt at that very moment. The one thing that attracted me to Pulcinella was the way he could always make me smile, even when trying to be serious. After wiping away a tear, he took both my hands in his, as he had done many times before, and vowed to conquer any trial my father gave him, climb the highest mountain, swim the widest ocean, or die trying. I was worth it, he said, although it was hard not to laugh when he added in all sincerity that he really hoped it wouldn't come to that because he wasn't sure he could even swim. As he then bowed his head to kiss both my hands as usual, I glanced over at Governess. She was looking out across the gardens. I leaned forward and gently kissed him on his head, blushing with embarrassment and excited at his touch. He looked up at me and smiled. He had such a wonderful, cheeky smile that I could always see in my mind's eye whenever I thought of him. Our time was soon up. We were instructed to prepare to leave. As we climbed into the carriage, Father positioned himself directly in front of Pulcinella. An intimidating stare focused on him throughout the whole journey. Governess and I were made to sit alongside Father in total silence, 3 facing the 1. I could now see the fear in Pulcinella's eyes become more apparent as we drew closer to where we were to meet the beast. I was racked with guilt. If I hadn't been so bold, if I hadn't lost my temper with Father, Pulcinella would not now be facing his wrath. I glanced over at Pulcinella, hoping that he could see how sorry I felt, but he just winked cheekily and smiled at me. The wink had not gone unnoticed, and we were both brought abruptly back to attention by Father loudly clearing his throat. The ride was shorter than expected, probably only taken in order to give Father time to further intimidate Pulcinella, I thought. We arrived at our destination. Father jumped out first, ordering us all to stay, nodding at Governess as if to confirm some unspoken agreement with her. I watched as he spoke to the 2 carters standing by their wagon. A long wooden box with holes in its sides could be seen peeking beyond the end of the wagon. I looked at Pulcinella and smiled nervously, trying to reassure him everything would be all right. He smiled back, thrusting out his chin in an attempt at bravado. Father called to our coachman to release us. Governess alighted first, followed by myself, and lastly, in no hurry to dismount, Pulcinella. Slowly, reluctantly, Pulcinella and I walked behind Governess. Father was still talking with the drovers, now holding a length of rope and a 2-pronged pitchfork known as a bident. He handed them to Pulcinella, who, totally perplexed, took them, saying nothing. The carters opened the box and released the creature. Its movement was slow as it emerged from its travelling box, falling to the ground with a thud. It was the strangest looking creature we had ever seen. I screamed a little as it fell to the ground. The beast had 4 short legs and measured approximately 2 strides in length. Its tail made up the bulk of its size. The long snout was just a little shorter than the length of its body, with an equally long jaw and sharp-looking teeth that went all along the jawline. Its skin looked hard and scaly, and we all backed quickly away, not knowing what to expect next. We knew only that it looked very scary. Pulcinella looked momentarily afraid until his bravado returned. I was beginning to love this brave man more every moment, but would he still believe I was worth it, I wondered. He said he would conquer any trial Father gave him, but this creature, I wouldn't blame him if he were to walk away from the challenge. I would rather he survived to live another day. My heart was in my throat as I looked on. I could see the perspiration on his face as he faced the cocodrilo. My heart was pounding, as no doubt his was too. He laughed nervously and was talking to the creature as if it could understand him. I heard every word he said, and in hindsight it makes me laugh, but at the time I was so full of fear for him. "Who's a pretty boy then?" "You are a boy, aren't you, because you are such a handsome creature." "What's your name then?" He must have known that talking to the animal was stupid, but he seemed unable to stop himself. It looked like he was playing for time whilst he eyed up his prey. With only the two-pronged fork and a rope to hand, he would have to use his wit. He would have to work out the best way to handle the creature. The cocodrilo was emitting a sort of purring sound that we later discovered was meant as a warning. The beast looked docile enough from where we were standing. But Pulcinella was wiping his brow again with his sleeve, standing as firm as his legs would allow him. I watched him with growing fear as he cautiously walked towards the creature. "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty," he called. The animal seemed unconcerned as he turned calmly away from his potential captor. It looked neither right nor left as it slithered slowly away. Pulcinella moved closer to the animal. "Come on, kitty, kitty," he called once again, creeping sideways around the creature to get a better look. He grabbed for the creature's tail, but the creature moved its head round with a whoosh, snap, snap. I screamed a little at the suddenness of the move. Pulcinella dropped the creature instantly and jumped out of the way of its jaw, glancing over to where I was standing. I nodded my reassurance that I was fine, and he turned back to where the creature lay motionless. The creature was stronger than it looked. Its body had twisted almost full circle on its tail. Its jaw was still open wide, showing a mouthful of gnashing teeth that had viciously tried to bite Pulcinella. Fear now showed in his face, his body looking tense. The speed with which the calm-looking creature suddenly turned so vicious had taken everyone by surprise. The task wasn't going to be as easy as it had first looked. The cocodrilo stopped moving the instant it fell from his hands. The scaly skin was indeed hard and shell-like, and there was blood to be seen on Pulcinella's hands. It would be more difficult to hold on to. Pulcinella stood back and weighed up his options for a while. The creature, too, stood motionless, its protruding eyes on the side of its head, staring, watchful. The jaw slowly closed as Pulcinella walked carefully round towards its head. He was observing the creature's eye movements, looking more intently at his prey. As Pulcinella moved in closer, the animal still remained motionless. Pulcinella walked round to the tail end. When he was almost out of the beast's sight, he tried placing the pronged fork over the neck and grabbing the tail once more. Whoosh! Snap! The cocodrilo threw its head back and turned snapping once again, this time giving a low, deep, guttural growl. Its mouth opened wide, warning Pulcinella to stay away. Pulcinella only just managed to jump out of the way of its huge jaws before falling backwards onto the ground. Everyone stood watching. I clutched my dress to my bosom. Father showed no expression on his face other than an amused grin at the corner of his mouth as he stood watching his future son-in-law take on the monster. The look on Father's face said it all. The boy was either very brave or very, very stupid, and I had to agree he must really love me, I thought. Once more, both the captor and his prey looked to one another. I was reminded for a moment that Pulcinella and I had once watched some of the horsemen in their troop using a lasso to capture a runaway horse and bring it down. He told me he had never done it himself. Maybe now he was going to get his chance to see how much he'd learned. Great minds must think alike, for he started to make a lasso out of the rope he'd been given, and carefully checked that it was working correctly before loosing it again to the size he thought he'd need. Then, walking once more round the animal, he carefully placed the fork stick over the neck of his prey. He pressed down with all his might on the stick and gently dangled the rope over the snout of the creature. It slipped over the snout. It was working. The cocodrilo lay perfectly still. Then whoosh! Snap! Snap! And that low growl started once again. The cocodrilo was amazingly fast. Pulcinella was knocked backwards with the force. I started to wonder who was the prey and who was the captor. Pulcinella would have to work calmly, yet quickly. The creature's jaws were wide and threatening. It needed time to calm down, and from the looks of things, so did Pulcinella. He looked over at our little group whilst he was paused. I could no longer hide my anxiousness. The others expected him to fail. Please don't let him fail now. I willed him to succeed with all my heart and give him strength to continue. He had once told me of his mother. She had been a fighter during the siege at Nice a few years ago when he had been badly injured and she had been killed. But she'd shown him how to be strong when you believe in something. And Pulcinella believed in me. He'd as good as told me so, hadn't he? He told me he loved me and wanted to be with me for the rest of his life. He had to complete this task. For us. Once more unto the breach, he was once again speaking to the cocodrilo as he rose to his feet. Walking round the creature as before, we could see that he too was being watched by his prey, as much as he was doing the watching. The creature seemed to copy Pulcinella's movements. As he moved, so did the cocodrilo. Weighing each other up, the cocodrilo lay down on the ground to wait for the next move. Pulcinella did the same. After a short while, he once again worked his way round to where he felt was the blind spot of the cocodrilo. He placed the stick carefully over the neck He moved in with the lasso dangling over the snout. Then, more slowly this time, he drew the rope as closely as possible to the snout. Not too tight. Not just yet. Pushing the stick further into the ground to hold fast the creature, he jumped on its back at the same time, wrapping the rope round its snout. Letting go of the stick, he quickly grabbed the cocodrilo around the neck, while securing the rope around his snout as tightly as he could. The cocodrilo struggled at first, flaying its tail as hard as it could. The body turned over. Pulcinella clung to the creature's back and wrapped his legs round the body of the wild, frightened creature. Who was pinning who down was hard to tell, but eventually Pulcinella managed to overcome the creature as its body became motionless. Resistance futile. It stopped thrashing around. Pulcinella continued tying the rope round the snout, the neck, and stood up. His foot on top of the creature's back, one hand holding the rope round the head, another holding the animal's tail. He looked over at my father, a smug, proud and challenging look on his smiling face, and said, "Where would you like it?" Grinning cheekily at father, then looking in my direction, he proudly winked. Pulcinella had taken the challenge and won. I clapped and clapped with such joy. Father would have to accept that there was nothing more he could do to keep us apart now. Reluctantly, Father set a date for our marriage date, and was agreed 8th of January, 1554. That was months away. It seemed such a long time. But Pulcinella assured me that the time would pass quickly, with pleasurable thoughts and actions needed to bring our forthcoming marriage to fruition. He made it all sound so timeless.